Nvidia.
Nvidia's incredible rise is one of near bankruptcy, relentless ambition, and billion-dollar deals. How did 3 employees start a trillion-dollar industry from the desire to make better gaming graphics? A company on the cusp of a digital revolution which will not only change our world, but how we spend, are advised, and even plan our futures. In 1993, Jensen Huang, the future CEO of Nvidia, was working for LSI Logic as the assigned engineer for his 2 future co-founders, Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem at Sun Microsystems, building microchips. Frustrated with Sun Microsystems, Chris and Curtis left to set up their own company. The only problem was they didn't exactly know what they wanted to do. Calling Jensen, who was happily employed at the time, he decided to help them brainstorm ideas at his old employer Denny's. Jensen was familiar with the diner, having started his working life not in tech, but a dishwasher and waiter at Denny's. Over a bottomless jug of coffee, the 3 of them brainstormed ideas for hours. At that time, computers were big, bulky items. This was before Windows 95, and home usage was fairly limited. The only thing that most average people used PCs for were to play low-resolution games. But graphics and multimedia were virtually non-existent. No speakers, no 3D rendering, and just poor graphics. The 2D graphics market was already saturated, but 3D graphics was in its infancy. After settling on 3D graphics, their first hurdle was that none of them even actually owned a PC. So they went out and bought Gateway 2000, tore it apart, and began to design the NV1, their first microchip. Between their own funds and venture capital, they managed to scrape enough money together to hire an office and a small team for the NV1, a chip which would go on to turn their entire business upside down. The NV1 was a jack of all trades but master of none. Jensen would go on to describe it as a Swiss Army knife, nonetheless managing to secure a sizable order of 250,000 units from a company called Diamond Multimedia. The launch, however, was a flop, and out of the 250,000 units ordered, 249,000 were returned. The problem with the Swiss Army knife is that few people actually go out seeking it. Most are gifts from others and often end up unused in a drawer somewhere. Sorry, Mum. This failure of NV1 nearly bankrupted the company. But luckily, Nvidia had already secured a partner for its second chip, NV2. None other than Sega, the gaming giant responsible for 90s beloved games such as Sonic, Madden NFL 94, and of course, Streets of Rage 2. This contract was a multi-million-dollar lifeline after the disaster of NV1. However, the market was moving fast and NV2 was being built on outdated technology. The NV2 was using quadrangles as opposed to triangles to render images, and forward texture mapping. Big problems, as I'll explain. The issue with quadrangles is that they have 4 straight sides. This means you can end up with all sorts of weird images. The benefit of triangles is that they only have 3 points, so you're guaranteed to have a triangle provided the points aren't all in straight lines. Also, with 1 less line than a quadrangle, triangles are much faster to render. The issue with forward texture mapping is this. Imagine you draw a square, 100 pixels by 100 pixels. This creates an object known as a texel, the smallest unit of whatever bigger object you're drawing. With forward texture mapping, the processor works through each of these texels to decide where to put them on the screen. If you need to change the size of an object, it still has to iterate over every texel, causing many pixels to be overdrawn. Incredibly process intensive and slow. On the other hand, if you use inverse texture mapping, then your starting point is the pixel itself, deciding what texel to use for each pixel. This means that when the texel changes, the number of follow-on calculations for each pixel is far less, being much less intensive. This left Nvidia with a huge issue. They could continue making the NV2 based on the quadrangle forward texture mapping, which would technically fulfill the needs of the contract. But then they'd be left with a platform for an obsolete technology. However, if they didn't fulfill the contract, they would run out of cash immediately and go bankrupt. So, a choice between going bankrupt today or tomorrow. How do you solve this? Well, Jensen had a solution. He went to the CEO of Sega and explained that if he fulfilled the contract, he would go bankrupt. but he still needed the money, or else he would still go bankrupt. The Sega CEO slept on it for a few days and then called to say that Sega would release Nvidia from its contract, but still pay them. Jensen would go on to say, sometimes in business, especially when starting out, you just need to rely on the kindness of others. So a sub to this channel would really mean a lot. Free now to pursue the latest industry graphics, Nvidia could try to catch up with the competition. But they only had one last chance to get this right. Engineers were insanely expensive, and there was no money left for another failure. In effect, Nvidia only had the budget for one tape-out, that being the incredibly expensive final stage of production where the intricate designs for circuits on chips are sent to the manufacturer. At that time, building chips took well over a year. You had to build the chip, write out the software, fix the errors, tweak the chip again, tape it out again, and rinse and repeat until it was ready. So how do you hit a hole in one? Create a near flawless microchip without endless iterations. You work from the end goal backwards, designing the software and end applications first. Then figure out how to physically build it to address these goals. But even after all of that, will the circuit design physically work before you produce it? Well, luckily for Nvidia, at the exact same time they were going through an existential crisis, a company called ICOS had just gone out of business. ICOS was special. They had been in the business of emulators. An emulator allows you to map and place a chip in a virtual environment that imitates the actual environment for which it's designed. This way you could map it out and test it pre-manufacturing. Despite recently going out of business, ICOS still had one last emulator in the back of their warehouse for inventory. And if they wanted it, the closing down business would sell it to Nvidia. So they bought the scraps out of this closing down company. And this thing was huge, the size of a refrigerator, but it worked. Instead of taking over a year, in a matter of months they were able to produce their next chip, the Rivia 128. A masterpiece built on the right architecture with minimal bugs, it simply blew the competition away. Within 4 months it had over 1 million sales. The real game though wasn't the chip, it was the process they had discovered through making it, enabling them to build the next one twice as fast as the competition. With a healthy cash flow, their next chip was the most ambitious yet, one that could house a computer's entire graphics processing within it. It's a common misconception that Nvidia were the first ones to do this. In reality, a version of this has been around since the early 80s through video cards. But what Nvidia did do was popularize it under the name Graphics Processing Unit, or GPU. And with that, the GeForce 256 was created. Something so powerful that it would quickly become noticed by some of the biggest players in the market, notably Microsoft. Yet again, the stars seemed to align for Nvidia. It just so happened that Microsoft were working on their own games console at the time, the original Xbox. By using Nvidia's GeForce chips, Xbox was able to smash Sony's PlayStation 2 out of the park, with notably better graphics, just as gaming was starting to go mainstream. As lucrative as this was, the GeForce's best trait wasn't even its dedicated GPU. It was the world's first programmable GPU in wide circulation, ultimately setting Nvidia on the path from billion-dollar company to trillion-dollar powerhouse. With programmable GPUs, this opened up Nvidia's tech to much more than just gaming. Think scientific experiments, scenario modeling, flights, driverless cars, and financial analysis. In 2006, the company went one step further, launching a platform which would enable it to fully capitalize upon this. One called CUDA, enabling its GPUs to take their thousands of tiny processing units and get them to work in a parallel as opposed to a linear fashion, breaking any task down through thousands of simultaneous attacks, being far more efficient than one long linear process. The gains from this were massive, and it didn't take too long for the world to figure this out either. Soon the co-founders were hearing growing rumors of university researchers taking GeForce chips to run experiments way beyond the world of gaming. Jensen once told a story of how, on a trip back to Taiwan, he went to go see a researcher at the University of Taiwan. The researcher eagerly opened a closet and revealed a whole room full of GeForce chips stacked up on shelves with cooling fans. What the researcher had done was create his very own supercomputer, which was beyond his wildest dreams. These early applications would quickly become the mainstream for artificial intelligence researchers across the world, all with transformational results. You see, Google had been working upon early AI for quite some time. In 2011, Google had formed a deep learning AI research team, quickly achieving a new milestone as its AI research project learned how to differentiate between human and cat videos on YouTube. The only issue with this feat of engineering is that it required 2,000 CPUs to process, far beyond the storage capacity or budget of your average individual. But by using Nvidia's tech, other researchers produced similar results with just 12 Nvidia GPUs, triggering off a chain of reactions which would lead to what we now know as AI's Big Bang. Just a year later in 2012, a man named Alex Khristev at the University of Toronto entered the ImageNet computer competition. At the time, it was popular for researchers to hold competitions to analyze pictures as quickly and accurately as possible. Up until then, these competitions were dominated by computer vision experts who hand-wrote code, all until Alex and his team entered the competition with their creatively named AlexNet. Not only did AlexNet absolutely thrash the competition, they didn't need to write image recognition software to do so. Creating a neural network, AlexNet all by itself managed to learn and distinguish between images, training itself across millions of examples and trillions of calculations. And what made this all possible was Nvidia's GPUs. There's a general rule in the tech world that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit will double every 2 years. Attributed to the Intel co-founder Gordon Moore in the 1960s, this has led to the continued growth in computing power. Under Moore's law, GPU performance is meant to roughly double every 2 years. However, Nvidia's GPUs have more than tripled, leading some experts to claim a new law, one named after the Nvidia CEO himself. Known as Huang's law, it follows the observation that GPUs are now growing much faster than Moore's law predicted, all because of the synergy between the trinity of hardware, software, and not least AI. The applications of AI have been immense, with everything from self-driving cars, medical research, warehouse robots, to even ChatGPT utilizing Nvidia's chips to make giant leaps, compounding progress at rates much faster than anyone imagined even a decade ago. Just think about that. What you may have thought possible in 30 years could now be possible in just 5. Forcing businesses, industries, entire economies even, let alone governments, to come up with bigger dreams than their imaginations allowed. As we speak, the biggest companies are relying on Nvidia's simulated worlds, a literal third-body matrix, to try out their next generation of technology. All before those same technologies are tried out on you. Endless simulations across countless iterations of innumerable worlds. It's because of this 3-body matrix, a relentless AI army learning every second of every hour, forwards, backwards, and 1 billion times faster, that Nvidia went from a $100 billion company in 2018 to the trillions it's worth today. Why its CEO's wealth went from a few billion to more than 100 billion in less than 5 years. And why, whether we like it or not, a company started at a Denny's to produce better graphics will come to influence where we go, how we're advised, and maybe, just maybe, who you are. And if you're wondering what happened to the other co-founders, one of them still works for the company, and the other, he sold out in the early 2000s.